Good afternoon and welcome to CEC-UGC lecture. In today's lecture, we are going to discuss about the sociological theories of social change. Now, we are all familiar with this Greek philosopher saying that change is the only constant. Now, what does this mean? This means that change is something which is always happening and it is inevitable. So, it's something which we know that it implies change, implies alteration. Change implies transformation. Now, what do the sociologists have to do about when we see change everywhere? We see the change in our physical growth, we see change in the environment, we see change in the structure. Now, sociologists have time and again tried to make sense of the changes that is happening place in the social system, that is society. So, when we append social to change, we are going to focus the ways in which alteration in any kind of social structure impacts the way in which society is ordered or the way in which it results to conflict or violence. Now, since the inception of the discipline, social change is integral to the sociologist. The discipline itself emerged within the milieu of industrial revolution, large-scale transformations taking place in economy, politics, family. Therefore, we know that sociology as a discipline is centered around the conceptualization of social change. So let us, in today's lecture, traverse through a number of sociologists or sociological theories looking at the understanding of social change. Now, there is nothing which is kind of correct or incorrect, but these are multiple ways in which sociologists have made sense of the social change taking place in society. Now, when we try to understand social change from a sociological perspective, we understand it as a process that leads to an alteration of mechanism within the social structure. Now, social structure implies rules, regulations, norms, value, or what Parson would call as social system. So, there is an alteration or change in the cultural symbols, rules of behavior, social organization, or value system. And we all, as member of the society, have seen changes taking place in different milieu. Sociologists define social change as change in human interaction and relationship that transform cultural and social institution. Now, we are clear with the idea that social change means alteration. It implies transformation. Now, most of us are familiar that what would lead to change. It could be change in technology, it could be change in the economic system. So, today's lecture, we are not going to focus on the factors of social change or the consequences of social change. But the focus of the lecture is to make sense of a number of sociologists who have tried to study the process of social change. And therefore, we keep in mind that there is a time and space consideration. So, a sociologist and an anthropologist studying in the 18th century would differ the way in which it was conceptualized by 20th century sociologists. And therefore, a large gamut of social change like the women's movement, the LGBT movements, there are several kind of transformation in the education system or in the political system have been subject of study by sociologists. So we know that sociology, the concept of social change is integral. And if we go down to the discipline or to the origin of the discipline, we kind of see that sociologists, that is what is termed as fathers of sociology or the founders of sociologists, in his initial days or the classical sociologist, borrowed models of social change from the other academic discipline. Now, just to repeat, as has done in other lectures, sociology is the youngest social science. So, at a time that it was emerging, the other disciplines like the physical sciences were already having a grip in the academic milieu. So what sociologists did was they borrowed concepts, or they borrowed the way in which the biologists studied or the physical sciences were studied. And one of the discipline from which sociologists borrowed was biology. So we have this whole idea that as organism or organic bodies were evolving, transforming, social society, human beings, the behavior was also transforming. So the late 19th century sociologists, they used the theory of evolution. Now evolution means evolving. That is again in another way to say the two are changing from one stage to the other. Now this theory of evolution was there in biology, or the biological changes taking place in an organism. And number of science from Spencer to number of them use this biological organic analogy to understand evolution of society. By mid-20th, there was a change in the way in which society's evolution was understood. And this was the influence of linguistic theory. And structuralist approach comes into being, and most of the changes in social society was understood in terms of the change taking place in the structure and functions of the society. So we see that over a period of time, there are multiple ways in which sociologists have theorized the process of social change. And if we look into the idea that in the initial stages, we have a number of dichotomies, or we have a number of binaries through which we were making sense of society, changes taking place in society. So if we look into the chart, Herbert Spencer argued that society was changing from a simple society to a complex society. Now, what was a simple society? A simple society where the modes of productions were communal, where agriculture was a means of livelihood, the division of labor was kind of simple. And as industrialization takes place, as urbanization takes place, it shifts from simple to a complex society. Similarly, Fernandez Torres gives us the concept of Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. Gemeinschaft means community. You live together. You know everyone who is living together next to you. You look like a kind of a small closed-knit group. And as industrialization takes place, large-scale migration starts happening, people become heterogeneous. So it shifts from community to institutions where informal, impersonal relations starts taking place. Auguste Comte, regarded as the father of sociologists, gives us 3 stages of evolution: theological, metaphysical, and scientific. Similarly, Henry Morgan tells us that there are stages of development from savage to civilized. So the simple society where kinship relations were significant, where there was an absence of a political state, where there was an absence of organized economy market, it was considered as a savage society. And it's as rules and regulations becomes more organized, politics comes into place, it becomes a civilized society. Edward Tyler tells us the evolution of religion. And for Tyler, the most simplest form of religion was animism. Animism means the belief in the spirits and worship of souls and spirits. And through this, it changes to naturism, which is the worship of nature, and then to monotheism, which could be a belief in idol or a god. Durkheim, who is a functionalist, also gives us an evolutionary theory. Durkheim says that as society becomes more complex, the division of labor changes from mechanical solidarity to organic solidarity. And mechanical solidarity, the people are related to each other, but it is in kind of a mechanic, dependent on each other. But when we have an organic solidarity, it's like different parts of an organ which are dependent to each other, and they have to function together for the system to work in a proper manner. Coming to Karl Marx, he gives us the understanding of evolving of society from communal to private property. Marx was trying to understand the emergence of capitalism, which was rooted to the modes of production. And according to Marx and Friedrich Engels, it was primitive communalism, which property belonged to everybody. There was no kind of a single ownership of the modes of production. It led to the feudalism, where a few people start having a stake over the modes of production, to capitalism, where there was exploitation with those owning means of productions and those who are working on the means of production. And then there was a kind of utopian ideology where capitalism would give way to socialism. So these are the different ways in which we try to understand changes which is taking place through an evolutionary model. Now, when we look into the evolutionary theory, we need to understand it more detailed, because it is one of the classical theory to understand social change in society. And there we can kind of understand two kinds of evolutionary theory. One, which I already said, borrowed from biology and was kind of based on organic analogy, and the second was cultural evolution. So when we look into the first, that is organic analogy and biological theories of evolution, we know it is kind of coming in from the larger sociologists who were advocate of the positivist approach. The positivist approach was a classical approach to understand society by kind of giving us a stage or laws which was trying to prove that it functions, society can be studied just as a science, and therefore they were trying to understand completely, giving us a study of society very similar to what was prevalent in the physical science domain. Organic analogy was comparing society to organism, and one aspect of organic was that society is like an organism. Where just as organisms have different stages from an embryo to a larger state, and then it kind of becomes a full-grown child. Similarly, the society, if we look into the simple society, it could be compared to the embryonic stage, where it does not have or fully developed parts of the body, and therefore cannot functional kind. And as it grows, as it is developed, it kind of starts functioning in a more organized manner. The second aspect of biological analogy was the natural selection paradigm. So in social evolution, this was kind of mistaken assumption of the survival of the fittest. This idea of the survival of the fittest was given by Herbert Spencer. So just as we know that in an organic world, only those who are kind of suitable or most fit to survive can consider. So even in the society, if you are not kind of fit, it would be difficult to survive in an ordered social system or society. Herbert Spencer was one of the classical sociologists to have studied social change by applying the evolutionary study, that is the biological evolution theory. According to Spencer, biological organism and human society follow the same universal natural evolutionary law. A change from a state of relatively indefinite, incoherent homogeneity to a state of relatively definite, coherent heterogeneity. So you are a society where there is not many differences between the society. They are all kind of working in a private or communal land, having the same kinds of rules and norms, and therefore it's a homogeneous society. As new systems comes in, market comes in, industries comes in, new system of politics comes in, marriages and family undergoes change, the society becomes a heterogeneous society. And therefore, society grows in size, they become more complex. Their parts differentiate, specialized into different functions, and becomes consequently interdependent. So this is Spencer's theory of organic analogy. Now when we look into the second type of evolution is the cultural evolution. Now cultural theory of evolution is trying to understand the changes that have taken place in the culture Now, culture in terms of transmitted beliefs, ideas which pass down from one generation to the other, knowledge about the social system, skills, attitude, language, and we know that we often kind of hear this comparison that the belief system or the attitude of, say, people living in a particular decade is different from those living in the modern times. There are a lot of comparison between the belief system of those living in urban areas and living in rural areas. So there are change in the cultural setting of these society. Unlike the biological evolutionary theory, cultural evolution believes that the social change arises in combination of both evolutionary and biological influence. It's just not your organism or your physical change which is taking place. So your personality or the way you start growing up as an individual is not only an outcome of your genetic. It to a large extent depends on the cultural setting in which one is growing up. Similarly, the way in which a society undergoes a change is dependent on both biological and cultural influences. So human behavior is shaped by both genetic and cultural evolution. When we look into the theory of evolution, one name which is very common is Henry Morgan. Henry Morgan gave us this evolution of society from savage to barbarian to civilized. Now, the savage stage comprised of transition from human infancy to the development of handy tools and fire. So, the savage is completely without any knowledge of the surroundings, without any knowledge of how to extract from the natural resources. So you are just kind of without any rules, regulations, without any cultural norms. And once you start developing small tools and techniques, it changes from savage to barbarism. The barbaric phase is characterized by invention of pottery, animal domestication, use of metal tools, irrigations, and so forth. And then the final stage, which is civilization, is comprised of invention of alphabet and the development of language. Now, this development of language, kind of why it called civilized? Because language is something that makes a differentiation between the lower animals and human beings as kind of higher, because you can communicate. Through language, through communication, rules and regulations are formulated, and this helps us to give a organized structure to the society, and therefore the term civilized. Morgan classified society according to the level of technology or sources of subsistence which he connected with the kinship system. Henry Morgan was kind of considered as one of the founding figures for the study of kinship, with his whole idea of the kinship terminology, and therefore he is kind of connecting kinship to the level of technology in society. And according to Morgan, each stage of development of society was distinguished by a technological development and had a correlate in patterns of subsistence, marriage and political society. So we see that the change which takes place is all interrelated to each other. So if there is a change in the politics and the economy, the family and the marriage system also changes. So we again have a comparative between the family and marriage system of a simple society, which was more in terms of a sacred relation between members of the society, to moving through an understanding of marriage as contract or kind of union between two individuals. So these are all related to each other. So the family as a unit of social unit becomes progressively smaller and more self-contained as human society developed. So there's a shift from polygamy to monogamy. So we see evolutionary theory is kind of making sense of the changes taking place in kinship, in religion, in politics, in market, and therefore it gives us a kind of a holistic understanding of changes that's taking place in society. Another name which is very familiar in theory of evolution is Edward Tyler. As a basis of demonstrating his evolutionary sequence, he called he gave us this term, doctrine of survival. So just as Spencer gives us survival of the fittest, Tyler used the phrase doctrine of survival. Survival was obsolete or archaic aspect of culture, preserved from one stage of social evolution into another. So as we are developing, as we are shifting from one stage to the other, there are certain elements which gets lost in the process of transformation. Yet there are many which are retained, and these are the ones which are kind of survives. So living cultural fossil, just as fossils are formed from decays of left animals and plants. So we have a lot of cultural element which are survived over a period of time, over a few generations, and this fossil or living fossil provides a clue to the past. How do we understand our ancestors, or how do we understand society which was 3 decades or 4 decades prior to us? It is through this doctrine of survival which connects the past to the present and helps to traverse through these stages of evolution. In his book Primitive Culture, Tyler traced the development of religious thought from animism through polytheism to monotheism. So these are the stages through which the practice of religion, that is the ideas, beliefs centered around the people, changes. So you have a larger communal kind of a collective belief in certain spirits and souls to coming into the idea of polytheism, and finally to the ultimate stage of religion, monotheism, that is the belief in the supreme God or any personality. Now, what is very significant is that Morgan, Spencer, Tyler, these were kind of considered as coming in more or less from the discipline of social anthropology. When we look into classical sociologists, what we come to is the work of Auguste Comte. Auguste Comte said that human society evolved in a unilinear way. Now, when we go into the detail of evolutionary theory, we see there are multiple ways. One could be unilinear, that's from one stage to the other to the third. It could be multilinear, it's traversing through multiple paths. And then it could be cyclical, that it starts from stage 1 to 2 to 3 and back to stage 1. So Auguste Comte is telling us that society is traversing from stage 1 to stage 2 to stage 3. It's a one way or one directional change. He gave us 3 stages of social evolution, or which is known in sociology as law of 3 stages, the law that governed the social work. So as we are familiar that he is kind of belongs to the school of positivist thought. So he was trying to understand society as being governed by certain laws, just as we have laws in scientific studies, so we have laws here. And therefore, all knowledge human beings developed through the stage of theological, which is calling as fictitious because it's relying on supernatural resources which human beings have no control. And then you have shifts from supernatural religious beliefs to more metaphysical, and then the scientific. So in the theological stage, it's kind of various primitive man was kind of attributing most of the changes that was taking place to the divine force. In the metaphysical phase, which is an abstract force, changes are taking place because of some invisible force which human beings have no control. But the scientific or the positivist stage is a stage where every action can be explained through observation, through comparison, through a scientific study. And these actions are based more or less on rational action. So this is Auguste Comte. Then we also have Emile Durkheim, which we said that is differentiating society in terms of the division of labor. So division of labor in terms of trying to understand the relationship between individual to the collective and how they are related to each other in order to functions. When we say the division of labor is mechanical, it kind of says that this differentiation is limited. And when we say it's organic, the differentiation increases. The society becomes more heterogeneous, yet they are related to each other. So then we also have the whole idea of Talcott Parson, who kind of tells us that evolution is kind of taking place. Change is inevitable, it will take place, but when change takes place or a abrupt change takes place, this resistance to change, and there is a rationality trend. So this resistance takes back the disequilibrium to equilibrium. So Talcott Parson, as a structural functionist, was trying to give us the equilibrium model of social evolution. And then we have the conflict theory, which is Marx's theory of understanding change, where he's saying that the cause of destruction of each stage is within itself. When there are so much of kind of problem in that stage, it gives way to the next stage. So the final stage, which he thought was socialism, was the result of increase of class consciousness in the capitalist stage, and when this kind of become aware of the exploitation, they rise up in revolt against the capitalist class, and then kind of gives way to socialism. But then again this class will have its class differences, and there could be a upright or a violence. So it is not that structure is always in a equilibrium, but there is conflict as well taking place. So these are the different ways in which sociological theories of especially in 19th century made sense of understanding change or social change in society. With this, I come to an end of this lecture. Thank you.